Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us, particularly those who are joining us at 2 a.m. That's the ultimate meaning of sacrifice. So thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Bonny, Ibhawoh. I am the project director for Participedia Phase 2. I'm a professor of international human rights here at McMaster University, and I currently chair the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development based in Geneva. Before we start, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. For those of you who might not be familiar with this Canadian tradition, we open our events with land acknowledgement as a way of reflecting on our relationships with Indigenous communities here in Canada. Only last week, we learned of the discovery of a mass grave of 200 children who were part of the residential school system. So land acknowledgement is an integral part of the truth and reconciliation process here in Canada to come to terms with the history and the legacies of the state's relations with Indigenous people. So although this is a virtual event, we believe that we are all rooted in land. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that McMaster University, where this project sits currently, is situated on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people. Lands protected by the Dish with One Stone, One Pond Agreement. It is an agreement amongst all allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources of the Great Lakes region. So having said that, just to welcome everyone again to what promises to be a wonderful, wonderful event. Participedia is essentially a project in the study of democratic participation, public participation. And in this research team, we try to model what we study, practicing what we preach, if you like. So we're really hoping that this conference will be a reflection of collaborative and participatory best practices. So I encourage everyone to join the conversation, to engage. And I am really, really looking forward to what promises to be an exciting, exciting conference. Thank you, everyone. So I'll just pass it back to you. Yes.
Thank you, Bonny.
Thank you. Yeah.
My name is Susanna Lyons, and I am a deliberative democracy practitioner, and it's my pleasure to be coming here today to support you in connecting and sharing. I'm coming to you from the unceded and traditional territories of the Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, Musqueam, and Katzie nations. I'm wearing orange today and most of this week in remembrance, as Bonny reminded us, of the recent discovery of the traumatic effects and legacies of colonialism. And I think that it's a good reminder for that history and all the histories of what it looks like when we don't have a chance to really honor the voices of the people, what can occur. And that's part of what we're doing here today, right? Is creating knowledge and skills and relationships and networks and understanding so that we can have strong, healthy, thriving democracies that are really a tool to strengthen the past and create strong futures. And so thank you for Bonny for reminding us of that as we start our day together. And I'll just reflect very much that this session is deeply collaborative, as Bonny said, that the Participedia project is, that it is my pleasure to be able to host this conversation, but I am doing so with the support of a team of people, Pat and Jesi and Bonny, and direction from Mark and Bettina and Archon and many others, and the facilitation team helped strengthen the session as well. And so this is very much the product of a real collaborative effort, and we're going to get a chance to hear a lot of wonderful things over the next few days. Personally, myself, I've had a chance to work with some of you in the summertime as we were creating the application for the second phase grant of Participedia. But my roots in Participedia go back actually quite a ways. In December 2009, I was at Harvard at a workshop as a master's student to talk about early stages of Participedia. Since then, I work primarily in many publics. I worked for the Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform here in BC, large scale engagement. I worked for America Speaks for a number of years out of Washington, DC. And another area of my interest is digital civic engagement. So this is a real pleasure to be able to support your work. It's quite close to my heart. So let's talk a bit about what we're going to be doing here together over the next 3 sessions. So our purpose of coming together is, first of all, our Participedia has done a lot over its journey. And so we want to reflect on that and the accomplishments. We're going to spend some time today and over the next 3 sessions talking about some key concepts around participatory democratic innovations. Where is this field going? Where is this field going, and what do these notions mean? We also want to set the stage for Participedia's transition to new areas of work, and that'll be a real focus of our work on Friday. And then lastly, we want to strengthen our network, and thank you all for using the chat so well to start to connect with one another. Our themes over the next 3 days. So today we're really talking about our purpose and impact of the project of Participedia. There's no session tomorrow. We'll take a break. On Thursday, we'll reconvene. And here we're going to be delighted with a research exchange. If you haven't seen a Pechakucha presentation, it's a lively, very visual way of sharing ideas. And so we're going to hear from people who've been doing work around the world that are related to the work of Participedia, some emerging scholars, some more established scholars. And then on Friday, we're going to dig into the research clusters and the work of phase 2. So each day will have a lot of value for us. As I mentioned, today's focus is really on the purpose and the impact. And so what we're going to be doing is we'll do some introductions and pollings, get to know each other. We're going to get a chance to hear from Jesi, Carson about the Participedia website. We'll have a panel around the evolution of Participedia. We'll take a short break, and then we'll come back and we'll dig into democratic innovations, both getting some interesting conversation in a round table, as well as in breakout group discussions, and then we'll reflect together before we close. All right, so with that said, Jesi, may I pass it over to you?
Susanna, for your introduction, and thanks also, Bonny, for your words earlier. It's really beautiful to be part of this community. I just want to say that before I get started. So hi, everyone.
And Jesi, I realized I was actually going to say a couple words of introduction about you, but do you want to just introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'm Jesi Carson, a member of Participedia's design technology team. I also co-direct the Vancouver Design Nerds, who are responsible for our tech hosting today. And we also do design thinking facilitation in the wider community and globally now as well. Yeah, so I'll be introducing you today to our open source online platform, participedia.net, to celebrate how far we've come and what we've built together as a community. I'd like to also say I'm joining today as an uninvited settler on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. It's also known as Vancouver, Canada. Participedia's design technology team was formed in 2015 and is led by Amber Frid-Jimenez, Canada Research Chair in Art and Design Technology at Emily Carr University. I'm the team's lead designer, and Pan Kantidara is our lead developer. Our current team is quite unique, being made up entirely of women who continue to be underrepresented in the tech sector. And I know it was Amber's intention from the very beginning to create an inclusive team and to foster student mentorship within it. I began my work at Participedia as one of those students, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So thanks, Amber. I've learned a lot from you. Past team members are a mix of professionals and students. We brought experienced engineers from larger tech firms like Mozilla and Airbnb, who then worked alongside and mentored student designers and developers, and even students from other countries who were able to access our open source code. Our community of co-designers, importantly, is made up of all of you, so the entire Participedia network, who've participated in design workshops and contributed ideas and feedback to inform the design of our platform. Participedia's very first iteration was built on MediaWiki, which is actually the same open source software that powers Wikipedia. In 2011, the alpha version of Participedia.net was launched, and this version was built by a private development firm who owned the code internally. We determined that in order to support student mentorship, we needed to shift away from this more traditional client service model of web development and implement an open source approach. So this transition from closed to open source took place over the next few years as we engaged with this community in participatory design and collaboratively envisioned an updated version of the platform that was then eventually largely designed and built by students. Early on in the co-design process, we made the hypothesis that a project about public participation should itself be participatory. We took concrete steps to align Participedia's design and technology with its democratic and educational mission. First, as I mentioned, we shifted from closed to open source, and this required us to build a new site from the ground up. We established an in-house team, including women of color and LGBTQ+ technologists and designers, and we used a collaborative platform called GitHub to provide open source access to the new code base. Second, we identified biases by engaging in dialogue and actively incorporating feedback from this multidisciplinary community to ensure a diversity of perspectives. For example, the data collected on earlier versions was weighted to North American and European contexts, and it's now been updated to be a bit more nuanced and inclusive of the Global South. But of course, this is still a work in progress as we continue to expand the network and welcome new collaborators. Third, we designed interactive features to be more accessible to a general audience, as well as to remote and underserved communities. An example of this is that we made the platform responsive and accessible on mobile devices for use in remote areas. We implemented multi-language functionality to facilitate global knowledge exchange, and we updated the data model, as I mentioned, to reflect more diverse types of participation. As part of our design research, we created this diagram, which shows an iterative design process that helps to align a project's mission with the processes used to produce it toward more equitable and inclusive practices. We began with what feminist HCI theorist Shaun Bardzell defines as a critique-based approach to interaction design. Basically, we reflected on existing prototypes, identified biases and unintentional exclusions in the design process. So it's sort of about identifying those things. Then we moved on to generative. So generative projects, on the other hand, are more active and intentionally implement processes and designs that address the needs of underserved communities. So for us, that looked like taking those steps to root out biases and changing our practices to be more inclusive. I can share a link later on in the chat to our latest paper, which talks more about that. So a quick tour. Anyone can contribute to Participedia by clicking the Quick Submit button. Just select the type of entry that you want to publish and either fill in the Quick Submit form with some key information or do the full version to enter a complete case. Just a note that the first time an entry is published, it's translated into all of our supported languages. So for the moment, it's actually important to use the site in the same language that you're entering text in. But we're also working on updating that to improve the system. So you can stay tuned for a feature release related to languages. We're also working on upcoming 2 new tutorial videos, which will soon be available on our Getting Started page. This page is also really great for new contributors and offers links to guidelines for publishers and editors. And we continue to build new features and improve the platform based on your feedback and your research needs. For example, we launched the collections feature after working with the Privy Council of the Federal Government of Canada, who published a series of case studies, but wanted a way to showcase them as a unique subset of Participedia's larger data set. The collections feature then became central to rapidly documenting participatory responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And now our citizens' voices and values on COVID-19 collection is being referenced in a study that's being undertaken by the United Nations. Also in 2020, following the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, we were able to centralize data about racial justice initiatives using collections. And you can also now download CSV files containing the raw data for each collection as well. So each of these little subsets, you can grab those. You can also visit our research page to access the full data set, as well as codebooks for cases, methods, and organizations entries. Another way to get the data is to download sets of search results. So you can do this by doing a full text search in the search bar, or using search filters, which will narrow the results to whatever your interest area is. And then after you filter your results, you can click the download button on the search page that will automatically export those results as a CSV to your local machine. As I mentioned, there's those tutorial videos you can watch as well, so we'll link you to those later. A couple more things to share and then I'll pass it on. So our research assistant Veronica produced this data guidebook to show how Participedia data can be used to complement other data. She used RStudio as an example. So if you do any analysis or data visualization or other types of projects using Participedia data, we'd really love it to see it. So please send us an email or share your project with us on Twitter. A couple of quick examples of data visualizations done by my team. We produced these using Observable, which is a shared platform. And here we're looking just simply at the distribution of cases and organizations entries by country. And you can start to see this data is a year old, but if we updated this, that Participedia is starting to achieve pretty decent global distribution, but you can also clearly see geographic gaps in the data as well. In this sentiment analysis, the text from Participedia cases is read by a machine learning model, which gives each case a positivity score that's then rendered visually by mapping to an emoji. So this quick test and experiment gives us just a little glimpse of the potential of machine learning and AI to digest and evaluate data in new and experimental ways. And we're looking forward to exploring this a bit more in phase 2. For the educators in the audience, please visit our teaching page. Our Teaching and Learning Resource Center is a simple Google form and database where anyone can upload and access lesson plans or assignments, rubrics, and more. These resources can be useful for undergraduate or graduate classroom settings, as well as professional development for practitioners, civil society organizations, and NGOs. You'll hear a lot more about Participedia Phase 2 on the 3rd day of this conference, but to give you an idea of what's coming up from a design tech perspective, in Phase 2, we're planning a series of virtual co-design engagement workshops with Participedia's 6 new research clusters and teams to listen to the diverse voices and experiences in this network, the new people, and to support and facilitate collaborative research planning. And in parallel with this, we'll be able to collectively identify how Participedia's online platform and our larger digital portfolio might need to evolve and change as these new thematic areas start to be explored in more depth in Phase 2. Yeah, we also have some really exciting ideas for knowledge mobilization and communications being developed for Phase 2, but I'm not going to give away all of the surprises just yet. However, I am going to share a new video that was produced by myself and Pat Scully, Participedia's managing director, and also an amazing team of videographers from VoiceRaiser. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Yeah, Mukisa will bring up the video in just a moment. I hope you like it. Thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to working with all of you again.
I believe that democracy is facing its greatest threat since the end of the Second World War. There are forces that are threatening to erode our democratic principles and values across the world. Xenophobia, inequalities within and between nations, rising forms of populist nationalism, the disruptions of COVID-19 pandemic. Participedia responds to these challenges in democracy by mobilizing knowledge to defend and expand democracy around the world.
Participedia has produced a platform that allows us to very rapidly gather and map emerging democratic innovations. For example, in Cape Town, in South Africa, Black Sash works with very marginalized communities to develop the capacity to ask the state why it is not providing basic social services. The sort of north-south binary, I think, is being shifted in Participedia towards a more global perspective and towards a framework of mutual learning.
We're especially interested in Participedia in understanding what kinds of innovations work for what types of issues, when, where, under what conditions, trying to figure out how to translate democratic innovations that work in one context to new contexts.
Participedia offers a large array of experiences and ideas and proposals and experiments covering over 1,800 cases and 330 method entries all around the world on every policy issue and public problem almost that you can imagine. The Participedia platform has generated more than 2,000 active users who are contributing and engaging with content.
Participedia has a very exciting design team, women-led and women-driven.
The designer, developer, we are all women and all inclusive. The data are public, the code is stored publicly. We use a lot of open source technology. It's not just our team that get a chance to making Participedia better. Anyone could.
Participedia is useful for practitioners. In terms of accessibility, Participedia really allows for just anybody to look up how to do something in their community.
We've got a really exciting opportunity here to build a very long-lasting community of democracy practitioners and activists and researchers who can sustain democracy in the long term.
The vision is to make Participedia the global classroom for democratic innovation that all sectors of our local and international community can use.
Amazing. Yes, please do use the emoticons under reactions to give your applause. And thank you for using the chat. That was an excellent video. Yeah, real hands too. Thank you. And it's so impressive. Well done, as people are saying. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, once it's ready to be shared more broadly, please, you can either put a link in the chat or send it out through the network so people can share it with others. So what we just saw was a little bit about the incredible value that Participedia is providing. And we know that this is rooted in the fact that Participedia has been focusing on strengthening and mobilizing knowledge about new and innovative ways of doing democracy throughout the world. This project started in the summer of 2009, almost about 12 years ago, where professors Archon, Fung and Mark Warren, they dreamed up this project. And since it's found its success through phenomenal collaborations across disciplines through a global perspective. So we're about to have an upcoming panel that'll give us a look at how Participedia has evolved. It's my pleasure to pass it over to our moderator, Tina Nabatchi. Tina is the Joseph A. Strasser Endowed Professor of Public Administration and the Director of the Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration at Syracuse University Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Thank you, Tina.
Thanks, Susanna. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first panel. I'm very pleased to be here with our three panelists. Today, we have Mark Warren from the University of British Columbia, Archon Fung from the Harvard Kennedy School, and Bettina von Lieres from the University of Toronto at Scarborough. You just saw them in our video, and now you get to have some one-on-one time with them to hear about their perspectives on Participedia and its evolution. So I know our time is limited, so with no further ado, I'll just dive right into our first question. And maybe I'll gear this question to you, Archon. What was the original broad mission of Participedia, and how has that mission evolved in response to the changing context we're in?
Thank you so much, Tina, and thanks, Susanna and Jesi, for kicking off our workshop in such a wonderful and inspiring way. My name's Archon. I teach at the Kennedy School. My work is all about democracy, and it's really wonderful to be able to talk with everyone today. Tina, thanks for that question. You know, the original broad mission of Participedia is to generate more knowledge and more documentation, more understanding about participatory governance no matter where it exists all over the world. And since we've began the project, I think there's just a lot more of it in many, many corners, certainly than we knew about, but I think that has happened. It's really flowering in the last decade or so. Obviously, the largest contextual change in Participedia that really, I do think affects our mission, or at least how we carry it out, is the changing context of democracy itself. As Bonny mentioned in the video, in his powerful opener, democracy is under threat in many, many societies in ways that we haven't experienced or anticipated in many decades, especially in the more stable democracies that used to be more stable. I mean, there's large parts of the global South, obviously, where democracy has never been taken for granted and has always been a struggle, especially in recent decades. But that struggle for successful democracy is all around the globe now, and we see it in many forms. I think the term that people are using a lot is exclusionary populism, which I think is quite descriptive. And we see that in North America, in Europe, in Latin America, in India, in places where we began Participedia a decade ago. The basics of representative democracy we could more or less take for granted. And then I think part of the implicit mission of Participedia was to find all sorts of examples of participation that could make small d democracy better by marbling it in with different forms of representative democracy and those practices that in many societies have been taken for granted for 30, 40 years, at least. And since then, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of the rug has been pulled out from under those assumptions about the stability of representative government. And I think no one really, I really think no one can take it for granted anymore. And so that changing context, I think, reinforces the mission of Participedia, in that I think a lot of us, but then a lot of people all around the world are beginning to forced to rethink the fundamentals of democracy and how participation can play a bigger role in that. And I think Participedia is an important project, an important community to help answer those questions and explore them together. And we see that really, really important in constitution and even the writing of constitutions, most recently right now in Chile, for example, but also in Ireland and Iceland, as Ellen Landemore has documented. Popular participation, regular participation is playing a much, much bigger role in constitution writing in all of these new constitutions, despite the efforts of some people in Chile. They didn't win. The people who wanted more citizen participation won, and they're kind of getting it. And that's a good thing, I think, at least from my perspective. So that's one. Science is another one. I think the pandemic has really shown that science is controversial. There's a great article in the Boston Review titled "That's Not How Science Works." Right. And I think that everyone should read that. It's like the idea that there are people in lab coats who have the answer. I think the last year has shown, from the different directions that Sweden has taken, from Germany, from the United States on the pandemic, that that's not how science works. And participation in many, many forms, and public participation has to take a much bigger role in addressing science and turning it into effective public problem solving, whether it's about public health or climate change or the future of biotechnology, many other questions, right? And then I think where Participedia has been deepest ever since its founding is rebuilding democracy from the ground up with citizen participation. And I think that effort now is needed more than ever. And it's easy to think about big national elections or constitutional level, and that's really important. But so are the fundamentals at the very grassroots. And Participedia has lots of rich examples about how to do that well, but also how to do it poorly. So the big mission is the same. The context is dramatically changed, which makes delivering on that mission all the more important.
That's really helpful, Archon. I love how you kind of explained how that mission has evolved over time and how, the context has made it even more complicated. And this is a really great segue then to my second question, which maybe I'll aim at you, Mark. And that's, given this huge mission that Participedia has and the complexity of our current context, what are the strategies that Participedia has used, is using to execute that mission? What's the Participedia model in terms of activities and audiences?
Well, when we first started the project, I think Archon and I were taken with the speed of innovation, democratic innovation. There's just a lot of stuff that was happening. 12 years ago, we were thinking back, 10, 15 years and just seeing a huge amount of activity. We were trying to think about how we might begin to mobilize knowledge without relying on our usual small academic research teams. And Archon came up with the idea of a crowdsourcing website that would move knowledge, soak up knowledge from all sorts of different places, allow us to be surprised by innovations, and then move this knowledge across kind of places, borders, institutions, sectors, language groups, and so on. Now, one thing we learned early on was that a crowdsourcing website by itself wasn't going to work. We actually needed the crowds to populate it. And so fairly quickly, we started thinking about Participedia as a website, plus a community, or sometimes many communities of users, contributors, creators, and the like. And this pushed us, again, fairly early on to begin to think a little bit more seriously about what Participedia is for. Who are we speaking to? What are its audiences? What can people get out of it? And I would say we are still probably thinking about these audiences in kind of three kinds. First, academics and researchers, students who are interested in research and teaching about deepening democracy. We're still anchored pretty heavily there, and this has as much to do with kind of where we started, and of course also has to do with our major sources of funding, which are academic. We've been funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, plus pieces of funding from partner institutions and so on. But it's primarily academic funding and universities. But we also wanted to know what democracy practitioners and advocates know that we don't know. So it's pretty clear that we needed to think about this audience as really key to what we wanted to achieve. And then third, we're also hoping to move governments, especially governments that have openings in some way, governments that are looking for new ways to learn from and respond to their citizens. We've had to think about barriers between these audiences and hope that we can design Participedia. I think we have designed Participedia to help knowledge flow between and among these audiences. Of course, the key strategy here is this dual-pronged developing of communities and developing of the websites. The website, we're trying to develop a website that is as general as possible so that it doesn't itself become a kind of mechanism of exclusion, as in some ways Jesi's nice little diagram was suggesting. And so this is a constant exercise in imagination, trying to think about our audiences, where we go, how we open up the website, and especially open up the website to people, places, and audiences that we're just not thinking about. Phase 2, we hope, will be a great leap forward in this respect. As we'll see on the last day of the conference, we are redesigning the mission to become much more broad, to anticipate many more problems of democracy, many more possibilities of democracy. But there's still a lot that we need to design, learn, and so on with the help of our expanded communities. We've also been, this is the last thing I'll say, we've also been working on languages, and this was kind of technically hard when we started, and we didn't have a lot of money, so we didn't move on this very quickly. But it's become technically easier, and we can deliver the website now, I believe, in 7 major languages. Our aim through phase 2 is to get up to about 20 major languages. And I think we're going to be able to get there.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciated how you alluded to the fact that you can't just build a crowdsourced platform and expect people to come. But I do know that you and Archon and Pat and so many other people did such tremendous legwork to connect with networks, to build those networks, and then people came because of that vision. I also appreciated that you said Participedia was in some ways an exercise in imagination, but it's also an exercise that has real world impacts. And Bettina, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impacts of Participedia. This isn't just a vision, it also has meaning on the ground.
Thank you, Tina, and hi, everybody. I'm Bettina von Lieres, and I work at the University of Toronto in Scarborough, but originally worked in South Africa. I think that one of the impacts of Participedia is that it has offered us a global community within which to revisit theory and practice on democracy and democratic innovations. And I think what this means is that Participedia offers us a community within which to learn about theory and practice from both the global north and the global south. And I think that there are a lot of possibilities in Participedia, for example, for learning by the north from experiences in the south, especially in contexts where democracy is threatened under conditions of high economic inequality. Yeah? I think the second impact is that by building this global community, we are learning about a much wider, I think, variety of democratic innovations than we initially had in mind. So at the moment, for example, we are covering formal, more deliberative democratic practices, but we've also expanded our focus on more informal, community-driven practices, including social movements and forms of protest that build the capacity of communities to speak to the state, for example. So I think that we've expanded our understanding of what democratic innovations are. And the global community has allowed us to do that, actually, I think. Thirdly, I think that we are building a global platform that is very interdisciplinary. Initially Participedia started off with mainly political scientists, but I've been looking at in what disciplines they work, and we now have development studies researchers, we have sociologists, we have urban studies researchers, we have anthropologists, we have very experienced practitioners. And I think this interdisciplinarity is actually giving us a greater variety of tools and a vastly deeper and richer understandings of the problems of democracy and the innovations that might help to solve these problems. So the interdisciplinarity, I think, has also been an impact that I think something we should grow and develop. Yeah. So I think that not is our applied understanding better as a result of our interdisciplinarity, but so too will be hopefully our theories that are generated from this interdisciplinarity. Fourthly, I think we've had an impact on students and young people. Yeah. So, Participedia has offered very easy and accessible
ways for youth and students to do research and to contribute to a global platform. And I think this is actually a very important impact. And for community practitioners too, it offers a very accessible platform to start to engage with research. And I think it's a very important impact, because in the academy, academic projects are often very far removed from students and young people and practitioners. And I think we are bringing research closer to students and young people and practitioners. Two more, and then I'll stop, Tina. Another impact, I think, extends to the ways in which we disseminate our work, and other people have spoken about that. A lot of research projects end up with publications in journals, but our attention has actually been directed towards a globally accessible platform in different languages, as Mark mentioned. So I think that our dissemination practices are more accessible. There's a lot of work still to do, but I think that's an important impact. And one last thing I want to say, and for me this has been very important, is that the way we work is also different, and I think is impactful. So we try wherever possible to make our own work together, our own collaborative work, very participatory. And that to me is something very important and impactful. A lot of research programs are not very participatory or very accessible to global researchers. And we are really trying to create a much more collaborative, open, inclusive, and participatory, I think, global research community in which people feel they have a place and they have an easily accessible place. And then, one last thing, I think another impact is that Participedia allows for the very rapid gathering of new practices or cases in times of crisis. So Jesi mentioned, that during COVID, Participedia has provided a place for pulling together emerging practices around COVID and post-COVID reconstruction. And so Participedia offers a place for the rapid, I think, bringing together in time, what was I going to say? As things are happening, right? And that I think is also an important, thing that Participedia has to offer. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Bettina. That's really, I appreciate so much what you've said there about not just the breadth and depth of Participedia's impacts, but how Participedia is much more accessible, much more inclusive, and has really built a sense of community around this important work. I wish we had more time. I could talk to the three of you all day about Participedia, but I appreciate you taking the time to talk about the evolution of Participedia, and I look forward to hearing more from you and others about the future of Participedia in phase 2. So thank you so much. And Susanna, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Tina, for hosting that conversation, and Archon and Bettina and Mark for sharing some of your insights about where we've been and what we've been doing and the impacts it's been having. Also, thank you to folks like Aklilu and Lord for asking these really useful questions about how Participedia shows up. And also I put into the chat an invitation, if you're aware of other impacts. Bettina talked about some of them, but if you're aware of some impacts, we'd love to hear those from you as well. And so the upcoming panel is going to engage us in a roundtable, followed by small group discussions where we're going to share and hear one another's ideas on these concepts and explore together why this matters for the upcoming work of Participedia. So at this time, it is my pleasure to pass it over to Simone Chambers. And Simone is a professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine in the US. Her research focuses on issues of deliberative democracy, constitutional politics, the public sphere, secularism, and the work of Jürgen Habermas. She's the author of Reasonable Democracy, Jürgen Habermas, and the Politics of Reasonable Discourse, and The State of Contemporary Democratic Theory, which is forthcoming. So keep an eye on your shelves for that. And over to you, Simone.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to see like a lot of old faces and new faces and be part of the group again. So our panel is going to dig a little deeper into this idea of democratic innovation. We're going to start thinking about, what makes an innovation democratic and what makes, a democratic institution or practice innovative. But in addition to just trying to get a kind of clear idea of in being more precise, that is what's to count as a democratic innovation, we're also, I think, going to look a little deeper into maybe some of the biases or prejudices that might kind of influence our concepts. That is the challenge really, I think that we're facing is to come up with a precise and really useful concept of democratic innovation, but one that can actually be globally used, that can be useful across all sorts of, plural contexts. And that's really very difficult to do. But we have 4 panelists today who I think are up for the job. And we've asked them kind of to brainstorm these challenges about defining democratic innovation. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to introduce all 4 of them, then I'm going to turn it over to them, and they're going to make little statements because we've given them that kind of that challenge at the beginning. And then after that, we'll open it up for a more free-flowing conversation and then breakout rooms so we can hear what all of you also think about the challenges of trying to get both a precise idea of democratic innovation that can really be useful in like counting them in the world, as well as one that can be adequate to the plurality of different types of innovation globally. So we're going to start. Our first speaker is Graham Smith, who could probably be described as Mr. Democratic Innovation. But in addition to that, he is a professor of politics and a director of the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster in the UK. He's also the chair of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, which is funded by the European Climate Foundation, and this is going to be launched this month. And then after Graham, we're going to hear from Edana Beauvais. She's an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University, and she is the chair of Participedia's Democracy and Digital Communication Research Cluster. And she's also the president of, I think, a wonderful, wonderful initiative at the American Political Science Association. It's the new group on democratic innovations. And then we're going to hear from our very own Bonny Ibhawoh, who is a professor at McMaster University, as you've already heard, and also holds the chair, the Senator William McMaster Chair of Global Human Rights at McMaster University. And he is, as you all know, the project director for Participedia Phase 2. And then our final speaker will be Thamy Pogrebinschi. I hope I pronounced that right, Thamy. She's a senior researcher at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center and a faculty member at the Berlin Graduate School of Social Sciences at the Humboldt University. And she is founded and is the coordinator of Latino Project, which is building a database of democratic innovations in Latin America. So I'm going to turn it over now to Graham to introduce the topic and, as I say, dig a little deeper into what we mean and how we use the concept of democratic innovation.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm really sorry we're not together in person because I've always found the Participedia gatherings of being really inspiring places and so many new friends. So I'm strongly associated with, I've never been called Mr. Democratic Innovations before, but I am strongly associated with the term. It goes back to 2004 when I was asked to write a report for an organisation, independent inquiry called the Power Inquiry, which was looking into the state of British democracy. And then I used it in the term as a title for a book I produced in 2009. And in both of those projects, it was used as a term to describe institutions that aim to increase and deepen citizen participation in political decision making. So it's very much looking at particular formalized spaces. And the report from the Power Inquiry was called Beyond the Ballot and was talking about how we could look to things like participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies, direct legislation, new forms of digital technology to actually engage people more formally in the political process. Why did we choose the term democratic innovation? Well, we were trying to capture something about the energy and imagination of emerging practices. We're also trying to, if we're honest, when we were doing it with the Power Inquiry, we were trying to capture civil servants and politicians' interest. And that actually, it was a term that kind of captured interest. So I think from the start, it was not a scientifically precise concept. And I think that's something which we continually need to do work with. It was a concept that was adopted by Participedia early on. Archon and Mark reached out for me when after they'd created their media wiki. And we, together with a bunch of postdocs and others, developed the initial data model for Participedia. And I think, to be honest, that had implicit and if you like, even explicit biases towards a particular form of participation, which I think at that time, also because of the members of the group, privileged a particularly European and North American way of looking at participatory democracy. And one of the great things about Participedia has been that this has been a space where that concept has been contested. So from the very early meetings, you know, people like Bettina, who we've heard from, Lyons, Françoise, and others, were making it quite clear that this didn't reflect well on a lot of the practices from the majority world. It didn't reflect well on a lot of the things that were happening within social movements or within workplaces. And recently, I wrote a short piece saying about some of the limitations of this term. I just want to quickly suggest sort of 5 limitations. The first is there's a danger that it privileges the fashionable, that it thinks that new is better than old. And I think there are some problems there. Secondly, it tends to privilege exemplary cases. And that leads to a certain methodological bias, as Paolo and Matt, who are on this call, have said before. Thirdly, I think it privileges invited spaces, those that are set where the state sets the agenda. Fourth, I think it privileges participation. I think some democratic innovations aren't participatory in character. I'm thinking here, for example, commissioners of future generations. And finally, it tends to privilege formal institutions. So for better, for worse, democratic innovations has become the organizing concept of this field. And I'm really excited to see how the concept will continue to evolve through this broadening of the Participedia collective in the coming years. So it's a real pleasure to engage with you. And I look forward, may the debate continue.
Wonderful, wonderful. Edana?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just actually going to share my screen for a second. And the first thing I just wanted to say is, so for my contribution, what I decided to do was actually look to see how often this term democratic innovation is actually used to describe what we would maybe think of as democratic innovations, as these kind of participatory processes or cases in the Participedia website. So earlier, Jesi gave you a really nice demo of how to use the Participedia website and how you can download the data. And so I did exactly that. I downloaded the data as a CSV file, and I got all the descriptions of these individual cases from the Participedia website. And then I imported that into R and did a text analysis. And so one of the more common things that people do in text analysis is they look at what are called bigrams. So these are pairs of words like democratic innovation. And they see how often do these pair of words or bigrams appear in a corpus of text. And usually bigrams kind of point to important subjects or concepts that are prevalent in these texts. So looking now at all of the 1,850 Participedia cases, I've graphed the most common bigrams or pairs of words, like democratic innovations. And we do want to be careful analyzing some of these pairs of words because they kind of show up in the questions that ask people to write about these cases. But we can see that the most common bigrams are terms like participatory budgeting or participant recruitment that occur well over 1,000 times. Over 1,500 times. But even words like civil society or climate change are pretty common bigrams that are occurring that have over 500 mentions in the cases. And democratic innovations is not a very common bigram, as it turns out. It ranks about 51st. So I've put it here at the bottom of this. That's why I have so many terms, is because it's actually not very common. It's mentioned only about 296 times. And so looking now at the question that Graham alluded to, whether there's this north-south bias, we can see that there is a kind of divide in the north-south. So the term democratic innovations, most of the mentions, over 250 of the total 296 mentions, come from global north cases. Very few of the mentions, only this bigram, the set of words, democratic innovations, only appears just over 50 times in cases from the global south. So it's not a very common bigram or set of words that comes from the global south. I've also graphed, so what this is this is a network graph So this, I'm going to show you, it's just that the term democratic innovations is not a very central term to the discourse, even in global north cases. So this is a network graph of the 50 most common bigrams from Participedia cases in the global north. And we can see that the bigram democratic innovation, the set of words, it links to some other words, but it's not a very kind of central kind of node in terms of the common terms that appear in these cases. So democratic innovations is here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Links with democratic innovations and democratic catching, not sure what that refers to. But it's not as central as a word like deliberative, which links to a lot of other bigrams or sets of words like deliberative democracy, deliberative polling, deliberative poll, deliberative wave, etc. And it does not feature in the top 50 common bigrams from the global south. So I haven't shown you that graph, but I can during the Q&A if you're curious. And so we're using different terms when we're talking about these kind of cases in the global north and the global south. I also wanted to see if maybe, are we talking about the same topics in these, covering the same topics in these cases, even if we're using different terminology? And I won't go into detail about this graph because I'm out of time. But essentially the short answer is using this kind of text analysis, this topic analysis. I find that actually cases from the global north and cases from the global south are covering different topics. And as I mentioned, they're not talking about democratic innovations in the global south. I would conclude that this is probably a good thing. The fact that the term democratic innovations is not actually that prevalent from the ground up. It's more of like an academic term. And the fact that it still, isn't very central to discourses sort of from the bottom up. I think it's a good thing because it leaves us space to kind of define or redefine this term democratic innovation in a more inclusive way that covers both the topics we talk about in the global north and in the global south.
That was great. So it turns out democratic innovation is itself an innovation. So Bonny, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so hi, I see the concept of democratic innovation as a useful conversational starting point rather than the totality of the conversation. And, just like Graham said, when it was first conceived, it wasn't conceived to include all the parameters. But in Graham's 2009 book, I found those 4 parameters that he outlines for assessing what he calls the democratic goods quite useful, inclusiveness, popular control, considered judgment, and transparency. And for me, the interesting thing about this initial idea is that it provides a framework to identify what we should be looking out for. And what I think Participedia brings to the conversation is that it provides an opportunity to draw on the practical experiences and what people are actually doing to reconceptualize and re-theorize this core that was first thought of several years ago. So I think of it as a creative tension between theory and practice. And so the notion of democratic innovation, if you like, is a kind of foundational concept that needs to be continually reinforced, reinterrogated as we expand our practice base, which is something that Participedia provides. And just to give you an example of what I do with the concept of democratic innovation. So I work in the area of international human rights and democratic transitional justice. And so I'm interested in participatory transitional justice processes. And I'm also interested in participatory post-conflict peace-building processes. Now, that is very different from perhaps what was originally envisaged. But I'm interested in things like grassroots truth and reconciliation commissions, all these initiatives that are, kind of organizing to have, for people to have a voice in the democratic space in very fragile contexts. I mean, you take the case of a post-conflict society, for instance, the state is still very fractured. The parameters, the usual parameters for democratic participation are not there. And so for me, the notions, these democratic goods that we talk about, whether it's inclusiveness, popular control, considered judgment, or transparency, would mean something very different in a transitional justice context than say in an established industrial democracy. And I think it is that flexibility and that reimagination that Participedia allows us to do and do very well. And just to close, I also think that there is always going to be a creative tension between theory, concept, and practice when we talk about democratic innovation. And let's take two examples, inclusiveness and popular control. So I very easily see that, at least in my work, a tension between those democratic goods when you're talking about democratic innovation. Because if you want to include the voices of marginalized minorities, it might challenge the notion of popular control. So these kinds of creative tensions will continue to exist. And I think this is, again, why I believe that the notion of democratic innovation is still useful. The core ideas I find useful for my work. But I also think that Participedia provides for us an exciting opportunity to begin to expand. I like to use the term flexibility to think about this concept in a more flexible way, in a way that makes it useful to the work we all do. I'll stop there and perhaps we'll have a conversation about this later on.
Thank you so much, Bonny. Thamy, would you like to jump in there?
Yeah. So hello, everyone. It's great to be here. So what I have to say overlaps and goes somehow in the same direction of what Graham, Edana, and Bonny just said. And basically, I'd like to make 2 points. One is related to the past, and the other to the present and the future of democratic innovations. First, I think that despite all its limitations, there is no better concept than democratic innovation. But I think we must definitely improve our understanding of what democratic innovation means and expand the concept's definition so it better describes empirical reality. If we look to Latin America, for example, and take a closer look at the 3,700 democratic innovations we mapped at the Latino Project, we'll see that most cannot be described as institutions that have been specifically designed to increase and deepen citizen participation in the political decision-making process. I'm quoting Graham here. What we see instead is that many are not institutions, often also not formalized in any way. Many have even not been designed to increase citizen participation, and most involve no participation in decision-making at all. However, they do address several relevant democratic problems, they do enhance democracy in numerous ways, and they do this through forms of citizen participation different than those associated to representative democracy. My second point is that what we name democratic innovation is clearly under challenge now due to the COVID-19 pandemic. While some people believe that the pandemic is suppressing the civic space and hence undermining democratic innovations, I see things in an opposite direction. In many countries and in many cities, the pandemic has enabled an actual expansion of democratic innovations. However, this boom of democratic innovations makes even clearer how urgent it is that we redefine the concept to fit an always changing empirical reality. I think the pandemic has not hindered democratic innovation, but it has done 2 important things. First, it has hit the main concept we always associated to democratic innovation, which is citizen participation. Second, it has affected the main form of citizen participation we have always associated to democratic innovation, which is deliberation. And third, it has accelerated the use of digital technologies to innovate democracy, something we still have little knowledge in our field. The COVID-19 pandemic triggered unforeseen problems of diverse kinds, and most governments were not prepared. But interestingly enough, in countries with low state capacity and high social inequality, it's actually where challenges have been even greater. Unorganized citizens and civil society organizations have been many times more responsive than governments in addressing problems related to the pandemic. In Latin America, for example, they have also compensated for the lack of responses in denialism of government. And they have done so by means of digital technology, crowdsourcing crucial information and knowledge. And this even in countries with a huge digital divide and low access to the internet. I have few bets here to finish. First, I bet civil society will come out of this pandemic more empowered. Second, I bet digital technology will turn citizens and CSO less dependent on governments and international donors organizations. Third, I bet what is called collective intelligence may revolutionize our field. And fourth, I bet that we may soon have to redefine citizen participation in order to understand how innovative democracy can be. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. So, I mean, one of the things that came out of this discussion was, as Bonny said, the kind of creative tension between the theory and the practice, or what's happening on the ground, and the kind of our concepts of democratic innovation. And as was mentioned earlier, I'm writing this book on, it's really the philosophy or democratic theory. And one of the chapters is going to be on democratic innovation. And I've read a lot of books about democratic theory, and no books really have deal with democratic innovation as a theoretical or philosophical concept. And I see it actually everywhere. So that's why I've decided that it really is an important concept to introduce and to talk about it when we talk about the philosophy. But in my dealing with it, there's this tension not only between the theory and the practice, but between theory, practice, and the normative dimension. So I want to ask you all four of you about kind of the role you see in the relationship between Participedia as a mission and this concept of democratic innovation, and whether or not there's a tension between the mission of, like, say, counting innovations, figuring out what is innovative and going out to the world and just getting knowledge, versus promoting innovation. Because there is this energy within Participedia that's promoting democracy, or sees many democratic innovations as answers to democratic crisis all across the world. And do you see any tension between this project of just, getting as much knowledge, counting, getting yourself a really clear and precise category that people can go out and say, this counts as innovation, this doesn't count as innovation, versus the project of really promoting sort of more robust and healthy democracies around the world in different ways? And I'm going to start with Bonny, put him on the spot, because he's kind of our leader in this, and see whether he thinks there is a tension, or how you kind of navigate that question.
Yeah, I actually don't think there's a tension. If anything, I think there's a complementarity. Because when we first started thinking about Participedia Phase 2, one of the questions that came up very clearly was, it's not enough to just curate this fantastic, database of innovations. We should have some kind of normative statements about what works and what does not work. So in the questions of human rights, for instance, we've been interested in what makes a successful innovation. How do local actors on the ground understand success in what they do, whether it's innovative or not? So I think for Participedia, the goal should go beyond just defining, the normative goal should go beyond just defining whether a project is innovative or not. I think that will have little value to the practitioners on the ground who invest so much time and resources into Participedia. We academics and researchers might be excited about that, but I'm more interested in best practices and understanding what works, how people who use this process, who develop this process, understand it, assessment of what's a success and what's a failure over time as that change. And so I would say that rather than the creative tension between theory and practice, which you've rightly extended now to the normative values that underpin the whole notion of democratic innovations, are not contradictory. If anything, they're part of a complementary creative tension, because Participedia aims to serve not just researchers, but also practitioners and policymakers. And if you see it from that perspective, then the normative dimension really should be key in how we assess what we might categorize as a democratic innovation.
Wonderful. Anybody else like to jump in on that? Graham?
So there has always been a tension, I think, that you're pointing to actually within Participedia of getting as many cases as you can and kind of promoting, if you like, if we want to use the phrase, best practice. And one of the things we've always wanted to do from a social scientific perspective is have as many failures and poor cases and weak examples as possible. And this goes back to Mark's point about trying to build the crowd. The crowd of practitioners and policymakers weren't that keen on giving us their examples of failed cases and weak cases. And so there is an issue here, which is that, you know, in terms of promoting, you really want to kind of promote the exemplary cases. In terms of doing, in terms of trying to look at democratic reform, in terms of social science, you want to have the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there is, I think it's something we have to own, and we have to try and figure out how we deal with that, because we do want to showcase examples of where things didn't work, but that can also be used to our detriment as part of the normative project of trying to innovate democracy. So there is a challenge here. It is a schizophrenia, which, as researchers and activists, because I think most of us on this call are probably mixtures of researchers and activists, and I think it's something we always have to balance in our working lives.
Simone, you're muted.
Sorry, Thamy, I was gonna ask, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure, and I can hear you. I think, well, creating knowledge is promoting democracy anyway, but the question is what kind of knowledge and for who? I think that when the goal is creating academic knowledge, then it does matter what counts and what does not count as democratic innovations, in the sense that definitely it's important to have as many more democratic innovations, whatever we define it, displayed at Participedia. But then for academic research, maybe it is important to work with an unified concept that allows for measurement and comparison. But I guess main challenge here, and that I would say also based on the experience we had at the Latino project, which is different but similar, is that in order to make these knowledge and democratic innovations helpful to promote democracy, then we have really to reach those that may really promote democracy. I mean, it's not just the academics. And then how do we really get this knowledge to governments, to policymakers? And to civil society actors. So I think this is something that is important to be always present. I mean, to have this both ways, not only in the definition of the concept, but also on how then democratic innovations will be presented, and how this will reach the audience that we want to reach if we want to this knowledge to promote democracy.
Great. And Edana, do you want to, I think we have just a few more minutes before we're going to break out into some, we can have further discussions in our breakout rooms, but do you want to add anything, or particularly that very interesting point that you said, actually, it's good that it's not a central concept, because now we can really, this gives us the opportunity to define and expand it. And so it was interesting that you thought it's going to come from the top down as opposed to bottom up, and that's a positive thing. So if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing that, as academics, we haven't, we use this term a lot, but it hasn't necessarily spread to popular discourses. So in terms of our efforts to mobilize that concept, we should just be a little more democratic in terms of how we define it to help grow it. But also to this question of, is there a trade-off between collecting data versus deepening democracy? I don't actually know if there is so much of a tension there, because I think that just by counting cases, by showcasing cases, I think that's tremendously empowering for people who might think like, hey, we're stuck in representative democracy. And so just seeing that there are these alternatives out there, it just kind of like spreads this knowledge about democratic innovations and gives people more ideas for how they can get engaged and engage others.
Great. Because one of the things that so the term democracy promotion, of course, has really gotten a kind of very bad rap. So that reintroducing, it's not like old school democracy promotion. It's democracy we're promoting democratic innovation, not just democracy promotion. But that term is, as I say, very fraught. So, but I think these were all wonderful answers to how you pursue the promotion of democracy without being, democracy promoting in the wrong kind of ways. But our Uber boss, Susanna, I think, is this now my clock says that it's time for us to, where did she go?
That's a perfect time to transition. Thank you so much, Simone and Edana and Bonny and Thamy.
And we will come back, the panelists will come back to have a kind of final series of exchanges on the topic.
That's right. So yeah, so you just set us up to think about how this complementary creative tension and really thinking about its limitations and its possibilities and the role of various players. And so we want to dig in together now. I heard some interesting threads. I had the privilege of jumping into a few groups, and Pat did too. And I heard some interesting threads across the groups. But what we'd like to do is actually turn to you and have you open up the chat and respond. What for you was an important idea that your group discussed? So let's all just take a minute, 30 seconds. What was maybe something you shared? Maybe it's something you heard. Maybe it was something that clicked. What was an important idea that your group discussed? Please jump in to the chat. So we've heard things, context matters, renovating instead of innovating. Institutions are not enough because they are reproductive. Do democratic innovations have to be participatory? The challenge of thinking of democratic innovations in autocratic governance structures, thinking about ensuring that the substantiveness of it, thinking about how to ensure that that our approach to democratic innovations really incorporates the views of participants, thinking about the link between social movements and formal institutions, thinking about the context that that a definition of innovative might be that if it addresses inequality, either negatively or positively, we're pushing against categories and assumptions, and we're building from the ground. We're thinking about the context in terms of the history. Is it really just a question? Is it a fashionable appellation for citizen participation and public engagement? Is there something really there? That innovations can be both positive and negative. They can be regressive. And whether it differs from innovation, what is the place of innovation? What is the link in institutions? We're really thinking about, is it only innovative if it produces a benefit, or if it's sustainable, or if it's a traditional practice that becomes evolves in the context? People raising ideas around that it's important for us to continue, that there is perhaps a call to action. What about, can all people do innovations? I also heard, and I didn't see here in the chat, but please do keep putting in other things that were there. I heard things about this notion of that if using innovation is something that has a bias towards better because it's new, then what happens with all the strong institutions and practices that are already there? I also heard a call around, focusing on innovation can erase some of the deep participatory practices that traditional cultures have been doing for a long time. And then what do we do with that notion? I saw lots of really interesting pieces there. And so you panel, you heard me summarize a little bit of what was in the chat. Maybe you saw some yourself. And Simone, may I please pass it back over to you to bring our panel together for a reflection?
Yeah, so my breakout session was fabulous. A lot of really interesting questions. You've heard a lot of the, I don't even know where to start to pick up on the questions. So you guys can, pick up anywhere you want, but one of the things that came up in our group and maybe a couple of others was the worry that innovation is going to be associated with new, and that there are these practices maybe that have been there a long time, that maybe we just discovered them, or also the acknowledgement that sometimes traditional institutions or institutions that have really gotten deep roots have stability and have been tested. So the worry that maybe in the kind of scramble and race for innovation, we will kind of lose sight of the strength of tradition and longstanding institutions and so on. So do you see any of that kind of worry in going forward with this notion of democratic innovation as being so central, chasing after the new? Anybody can, who'd like to? We can actually all take our microphones off and just kind of have
I'll speak to that. That actually came up in my discussion group as well, which was, we had a fabulous conversation. And as Susanna brought up that exact same point about this concern with chasing the new, and how maybe what we need are actually just creating processes that are sustainable over time and that lasts across elections. But others kind of spoke to this question of maybe we need to be careful when we think about the term innovative, like Laurence at UMontreal brought up that maybe we should be thinking of innovation in terms of a context. So it's not always that the process itself is brand new, it's just new in a given context or in response to a new problem. And Aklilu, who's a practitioner from Ethiopia, brought up the same thing, is that often we have these very old institutions that maybe we can just kind of reimagine or reapply to new circumstances. So those are kind of two things that we talked about in our group.
Yeah, we also discussed that in our group. And what I think is that to innovate has sometimes less to do with new and old and being new in a context and not in an order. I mean, but more in being new in face of representative democracy. Innovation is moving away from forms of citizen participation that are associated to representative democracy. And sometimes we do have forms of citizen participation within representative democracy that are old, but still they are already innovative in a certain context. And they will always be, I mean, regardless of the fact that they may be implemented in new places or for a long time or for a lifetime. But the important thing, I think, it is that they innovate in face of forms of voting, associating, protesting, demonstrating, lobbying, advocacy. I mean, forms of citizen participation that are associated to models or forms of democracy that exist within representative democracy. So to innovate is to move away from that, no matter how long it does exist and where it is recent or not.
I just jump in with a couple of thoughts. One is, I think, something that Jonathan Rose said in our group, which I liked as well, which was the idea about innovative for whom, which I think is a really interesting question. And we normally, as academics, the danger is, innovative for us. We haven't seen it before, but it could be innovative for public officials. It could be innovative for citizens. And I think that's really interesting question about the for whom. And I want to just make a point here. I think there is a real danger from what people have been saying of a kind of appropriation, where things actually aren't innovative for a particular community, but are then appropriated by another and seen as this wonderful new thing which they've invented. And I think one of the things that we probably don't do a good enough job of is sort of tracing the development of ideas which may have come, which will come across different communities, different geographical contexts. And there is a danger, although we try not to do this, of sort of these, because we look at particular cases.
Can you give an example, Graham? Can you give an example of that?
Well, the most obvious example, a couple of examples, I guess. One which I'm very familiar with is sort of participatory budgeting, which a lot of people in Europe who are doing participatory budgeting, a Brazilian would come and look at them and go, what on earth, why on earth are you calling that participatory budgeting? So there's that kind of, and that is a sort of appropriation of a term and not taking all of the practices with you, if you like. And I think that, I'm sure we can find lots and lots of examples of that. And I think one of the issues for Participedia is because we tend to be case-based, there is a danger that those cases can not always, but they can lose their context. And I think these are just things we need to be aware of. I just want to also throw in one other thing, which came to me as we were talking earlier, which is actually, I think this may be the first substantive conversation I've had in Participedia about the term democratic innovations. We talk around it. We've been talking about the data model. We've kind of like talked what's been included and excluded. But it's really interesting that this term has become an object of discussion today. And I'm kind of interested, I'm not looking for an answer for it, but it's really interesting that we've got this far with Participedia and not had this kind of in-depth discussion of this particular term.
Yeah, maybe I can just take off from there. Yeah, as we all know, conceptual debates can be incredibly exhausting and tiring. And I worried that, it was going to, and I've shared this view with Pat, that it was going to take the oxygen out of the room of the second phase of the project. Now we want to start on the second phase, and we're going to be embroiled in these unending debates about concepts. But the impression I got from my group was that people actually welcomed it. As one of the discussants put it, Participedia should continue to wrestle with this throughout the course of the project, because these are central to what we do. We've talked about innovation for whom. We might add to that innovation at what point, innovation at what moment, so innovation at what context. So it was a relief for me to get a sense, at least from my group, that people did not see this as some unending, exhausting conceptual debates that will take away from the more substantive work of the project, but more as something that is integral to the project and we should sustain throughout the life of the project.
Yeah, go ahead, Thamy.
If I may, I would pick up this example from the participatory budget that Carson mentioned, because it's the perfect one. So I think the participatory budget just completed 31 years old. I mean, it's not new, definitely. And so in some places, okay, it is new because it's being implemented for the first time, but then in Brazil and in Latin America, it's been implemented for over 30 years. So I think this exactly shows us that what is innovative here is not the fact that it is implemented for the first time somewhere, it has not been yet implemented, but it's the fact that it allows doing something, in this case, doing the local budget in a different way than it is usually done in representative democracy. It's not about the executive and the legislative doing that. And it's not only about including citizens in that, it's about promoting political inclusion and promoting social equality through citizen participation in the discussion of the budget, and doing that through deliberation and so on. So I think this is maybe important, there's a good case to look at it in order to understand what is innovative in a 31 years old innovation.
I think that's exactly right. And just looking at the chat, so we have people who are asking, like Kathy, who's asking, innovative for whom, innovative where, innovative when, why, when. And so it's really speaking to this question as you're raising, Thamy, about context. So it's always about context, innovation. And Patience has posted in the chat also, he has asked innovation why. And I think that's maybe the crux of it is innovation. It might be about, why do we need innovation as kind of responding to these problems of democracy. And so maybe when we talk about innovation, it's really just about having these like set of tools, or sometimes new, sometimes old tools that we can use in different contexts to respond to different problems of democracy.
I have to say that I think that's a great point. I was also going to bring it up because in Bonny's, original, both in the text for the phase 2, but also in that wonderful video that we saw, he clearly articulated the issue of innovation as a response to various types of crises. And so it's really interesting to connect specific types of innovation to specific, problems in different parts of the world and what needs to be responded, how. But thinking about that, I wanted to also pick up on Graham's claim that the limitations of a case-based approach to democratic innovation. Do you see that? Well, do you see that as a limitation? That is, so with a case-based approach, it's hard to kind of talk about large-scale democracy, like what is the problem with representative democracy, or talking about large-scale ways of approaching our democratic crises. So is there a problem, or is there a limitation thinking of democratic innovation only in this kind of case-based way? Like we have to, find a case of it as opposed to talking about it more generally? Everyone's got to take their unmute. This is a wild conversation. It's supposed to be.
Simone, you need a way in, and I think the issue is about sort of any way in is going to be there's going to be limits and to that way in. So if we were a group of people that were trying to look at structural critiques of democracy, that would limit certain discussions. So I was just trying to make us aware of the way that the major mode that we collect data may have its own limitations, but there are ways of a lot of the people who are writing and using the data from Participedia are using it in order to make more general comments. I'm just thinking it's kind of interesting that someone will need to write various histories and various kind of stories of how things move between time and space. And you can use Participedia as part of that. Would it be more than Participedia? Is that 2 minutes for me, Susanna? I've got to keep on for 2 more minutes.
I think now our meta boss, I'm not our Uber boss, our meta boss. So this is like, I could talk about this forever, but we do have 2 more minutes. Anybody want to
yeah, just to say, this goes back to, you know, the possibility that Participedia holds for that creative tension to continually grapple with this. So what are cases that are emerging and framed as innovative on Participedia? I'll really be interested in seeing how that grows. And the last point that Graham just made about some kind of historical narrative that kind of provides a backdrop for all of this, so we can go back and say, well, participatory budgeting was innovative in the Brazilian context 30 years ago. In Europe, 30 years later, it became innovative. Maybe in Africa, in 20 years, it's innovative. So some kind of benchmark that better helps us understand what innovation means in context.
That's great. So are we, Susanna, are we at our?
I think unfortunately we are, but I heard a call for collating this conversation, and so we will do that. And of course, there'll be plenty of time as we go forward. But Simone, let me pass over to you to close us off.
To me?
Yeah, do you want to just wrap up the panel?
No, this was fabulous. So this is actually, you know, I'm looking at this very, very selfishly. This is going to be wonderful material for my book on, you know, what conceptual ideas and new ideas about democratic theory, but also democratic innovation. So I thank you all. I'll footnote you. So we're wrapping up today, but we come back. Well, Susanna will give us.
No, and then you could. I'll take it over from here.
Okay, I just want to thank everybody. It was really wonderful, wonderful session.
All right, everyone, please unmute, say goodbye, and we will see you on Thursday.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
And good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
See you on Thursday.
Bye.
Bye.